The scream tore through the night before Alira Voss even understood why she was running. Fire lit the eastern ridge of the Moonfall territory, orange light climbing into the black sky like something alive and hungry. She stumbled over a root, caught herself against a tree, and kept moving toward the sound of her stepmother's voice, calling her name, in a tone she had never heard before. Not anger, not scorn, fear. "Alira, get to the hall, now." She reached the clearing where the pack had gathered for what was supposed to be the most important night of the year, the choosing ceremony, and found chaos instead of celebration. Warriors in the colors of a foreign pack stood in a tight circle, weapons drawn, while Moonfall's own guards shouted for calm that no one seemed willing to give. Somewhere in the crowd, a child was crying. Only minutes earlier, everything had been ordinary, in the way that Alira's life was always ordinary, which was to say she had been standing at the very back of the gathering, half hidden behind a support post, waiting for a ceremony that was never going to include her. The choosing was for pack daughters worth choosing, everyone said so, though no one ever said it directly to her face. They didn't need to. Her stepsisters, Marisol and Clarice, had made sure of that for years, with their soft laughter and their sideways glances whenever Alira walked into a room. She had told herself she didn't care. She had almost believed it. Now, standing at the edge of a clearing turned battlefield in waiting, none of that seemed to matter at all. A man on a black horse rode through the parting crowd, like the night itself had made way for him. He wore no crown, no ceremonial sash, nothing to announce who he was, and yet every wolf in that clearing dropped their gaze the moment he passed, the way water bends around a stone. "Where is your alpha?" the man said. His voice was quiet, but it carried, low and even, like something that did not need to be raised to be obeyed. Alira's own alpha, a graying man named Alden Voss, who happened to be her father in name only, since her mother had died and left her to a household that never wanted her, stepped forward with his hands open in a gesture of peace. "Kaelin Draven," Alden said, and something in the way he said the name made Alira's chest tighten. Not with romance, with dread. "You honor us with your presence, Alpha King. Though I confess, we did not expect the Crimson Wolves to arrive with drawn blades." "There was an attack on my convoy 3 miles from your border," Kaelin said. "Rogue wolves, unmarked, no pack scent. I lost 2 of my own men. I would like to know how rogues are moving freely through Moonfall land without your notice." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Alira watched the color drain from her stepmother Celine's face, watched Marisol's chin lift in that practiced way she always used when she wanted to look unbothered, watched her father's jaw tighten. "We will investigate immediately," Alden said. "See that you do." Kaelin swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, and for the first time, torchlight caught his face fully. He was younger than Alira expected an Alpha King to be, though there was nothing young about his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and sharp, and they missed nothing, sweeping across the gathered pack like a blade testing for weakness. "In the meantime, I understand there is a ceremony tonight. I have not traveled this far for nothing. The alliance still stands, doesn't it, Alden?" "Of course," Alden said quickly. Too quickly. "The choosing will proceed as planned." Alira felt her stomach drop. She had almost forgotten, in the panic of fire and shouting, why the visitors had come to Moonfall territory in the first place. The Crimson Wolves needed an alliance sealed through marriage, a bond between packs, to strengthen both against whatever threat was moving in the shadows beyond their borders. And Moonfall, desperate to remain relevant among the great packs, had agreed to offer up one of its unmated daughters as a bride for the visiting king. She had never imagined, not for one moment, that the man arriving to choose a wife would look like someone who had just walked out of a war, with blood still drying on the edge of his sleeve and fury simmering just beneath a calm surface. She had imagined pageantry, music, ribbons in the hair of girls who mattered. Instead, she was watching a king who had lost men that very night decide, with visible reluctance, to go through with a ceremony anyway, because alliances did not wait for grief. "Alira," Celine's voice snapped through her thoughts, sharp and low. "Get to the back, now, and do not embarrass this family." It wasn't a request. Alira had long since stopped expecting requests from her stepmother. She moved without argument, weaving through the crowd of nervous pack members, until she reached her usual place, near the rear of the gathering hall, behind a wooden post that had, over the years, become something like an old friend. From there she could see everything, and be seen by no one, which suited her perfectly. It always had. The hall itself had been decorated for celebration before the attack. Garlands of white flowers strung along the rafters, torches lit in careful rows, long tables set with food that no one was eating now. The unmated daughters of Moonfall stood in a loose line near the front, arranged, Alira suspected, in the order Selene believed would be most flattering. Marisol stood nearest the front, her dark hair curled and pinned with silver combs, wearing a gown the color of crushed berries that had clearly cost more than Alira's entire wardrobe combined. Clarisse stood beside her, quieter, but no less polished, her pale blue dress catching the torchlight in a way that made her look, Alira had to admit, genuinely lovely. Alira looked down at her own plain brown dress, the one she had mended twice at the hem, and felt the familiar, tired ache of not belonging. "He's not even looking at anyone properly," Marisol whispered to Clarisse, just loud enough for the girls nearby to hear. "He looks like he wants to be anywhere else." "Wouldn't you?" Clarisse whispered back, "after losing men tonight. Still, he'll choose someone. Might as well be one of us." Marisol's eyes flicked briefly toward the back of the hall, toward Alira, and a small, cruel smile touched her lips. "Not like there's real competition." Alira said nothing. She never did. Arguing with Marisol was like arguing with weather, pointless and exhausting, and she had learned years ago to simply let the words pass over her, the way rain passed over stone. It stung anyway, every time, no matter how many times she told herself it wouldn't. Alden cleared his throat at the front of the hall, and the low murmur of conversation died down. "Alpha King Draven, Moonfall Pack welcomes you, despite the tragedy of tonight, and offers our daughters for your consideration, in accordance with the alliance agreed upon by our elders." Kalen said nothing for a long moment. He stood near the front of the hall, arms folded, his expression unreadable, and Alira noticed that he had not once looked at the row of carefully arranged daughters, the way a man was supposed to look at women he might choose to marry. He looked instead like a man doing arithmetic in his head, weighing numbers that had nothing to do with beauty. "Proceed," he said finally. One by one, the daughters were presented. Alira watched from behind her post as girl after girl stepped forward, offered a shy curtsy, or a bold smile depending on their nature, and recited the small rehearsed lines Selene had drilled into all of them for weeks. Kalen listened to each one with the same distant courtesy, nodding, saying little, his pale eyes drifting past each girl, as though searching for something none of them possessed. When Marisol stepped forward, she did so with more confidence than any girl before her, dropping into a curtsy so graceful it looked effortless, though Alira knew for a fact she had practiced it in front of a mirror for 3 straight nights. "Alpha King," Marisol said, lifting her chin just enough to catch the torchlight at a flattering angle. "Moonfall is honored by your presence, tragedy and all. I would be honored further still to stand beside you, should you find me worthy." It was a good line. Alira had to admit that much. Kalen's expression flickered, something like mild interest crossing his face for the first time all evening, and for one terrible, familiar moment, Alira felt the old ache of watching someone else win a prize she had never even been allowed to compete for. Then his eyes moved on, past Marisol, past Clarisse, past every carefully arranged daughter in that glittering line, and swept toward the back of the hall. Toward the post Alira was hiding behind. Her breath caught. Surely he was looking at something else. Surely there was nothing back here worth a king's attention. No reason for those pale winter eyes to narrow slightly, to focus, to stay fixed on the shadowed space where she stood half-hidden. "Who is that?" Kalen said. The hall went silent in a way Alira had never experienced before, a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Heads turned, dozens of eyes followed the direction of the king's gaze, searching for whatever had caught his attention, until they found her, standing frozen behind her post like a rabbit caught in open ground. A ripple of laughter broke the silence, quiet at first, then growing bolder as more of the crowd understood the situation. Someone near the front actually snorted. Alira felt her face burn with a heat that had nothing to do with the torches around them. "That's no one, Alpha King," Selene said quickly, stepping forward with a tight, apologetic smile. "A distant relation. She is not part of the choosing." I did not ask if she was part of the choosing, Kalen said. His voice had not changed at all. Still calm, still even. But something in it now made the laughter stutter and die. I asked who she is. Alira's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack a rib. Every instinct told her to step further back into the shadows, to disappear the way she always disappeared, to let this moment pass over her like every other moment in her life had passed, unremarkable and unremarked upon. But the king's gaze held her in place, steady and unblinking, and she found she could not look away even if she tried. Her name is Alira, Alden said, after an uncomfortable pause. My late wife's daughter. She was not raised to expect consideration in matters such as this. Wasn't she? Kalen took a step forward, then another, moving down the length of the hall with unhurried purpose, while every eye in the room tracked his path. The daughters he had already greeted, Marisol among them, stood frozen in stunned confusion as the king walked past them entirely, past the glittering line of girls, arranged specifically to win his favor, toward the shadowed post at the back, where Alira stood rooted to the ground. He stopped an arm's length away from her. Up close, she could see the exhaustion beneath his composure, the faint tension in his shoulders that spoke of a battle fought only hours before, and something else too, something quieter, a kind of focus she did not understand and could not name. Alira, he said, testing the sound of her name the way one might test the weight of a coin. You did not step forward with the others. I was not asked to, Alpha King, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Why not? She glanced past him, toward Celine's rigid face, toward Marisol's stunned expression, toward the whole watching hall that had spent years teaching her exactly what she was worth. I am not considered eligible. By whom? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating in its simplicity. Alira had no answer that would not shame her family in front of a king, and so she said nothing at all, standing silent, while the entire pack watched a moment unfold that none of them, including her, had any way of understanding. Kalen studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes tracing her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made it impossible to do so at the same time. Then, without warning, without ceremony, without any of the pageantry the evening had promised, he spoke 3 words that would break the world she had always known into pieces. She's mine, he said. I choose her. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, Alira was certain she had misheard him. The words did not fit into any version of reality she understood. Kings did not choose girls who hid behind posts. Kings did not walk past rows of beautiful, carefully prepared daughters to stop in front of the one person in the room everyone had agreed, without ever saying it aloud, was unworthy of being seen. Then Marisol's voice cracked through the silence, high and disbelieving. That is a mistake. It is not, Kalen said, without turning to look at her. Alpha King, Celine said, stepping forward with the particular urgency of a woman watching her carefully built plans collapse in real time. Surely you misunderstand. Alira has no training, no standing, no dowry to offer your kingdom. My own daughters have been raised specifically to— I did not ask what your daughters were raised for, Kalen said, cutting her off with the same flat, unhurried authority he had used on Alden earlier that night. I asked a question, and it has been answered. This is Alira. I choose her. Somewhere behind Alira, she heard Clarice whisper something to Marisol, low and disbelieving, and she caught only fragments of it, something about a joke, something about pity, something about how this could not possibly be real. She understood the impulse. Standing there, feeling the weight of Kalen's gaze, and the weight of an entire hall's stunned silence pressing down on her at once, she did not believe it either. Alpha King, Alden said carefully, if I may. This ceremony was arranged with certain expectations in mind. An alliance of this significance typically requires a bride prepared for the responsibilities that come with. I am aware of what alliances require, Kalen said. I have honored more of them than you have, years leading this pack, Alden. I did not travel here to be lectured on protocol by a man whose territory cannot keep rogue wolves from crossing into it unnoticed. I have made my choice. Unless Moonfall intends to withdraw from this alliance entirely, the matter is settled. The threat, quiet as it was, landed with the force of a blow. Alira watched her father's face shift through several expressions in rapid succession: calculation, frustration, and finally, reluctant acceptance. Moonfall needed this alliance. Everyone in that hall understood it, even the daughters who had spent weeks preparing to win a king's favor. Even Alira herself, who had understood it only in the abstract, until this very moment, when the abstract had become devastatingly personal. Of course not, Alden said. The alliance stands. If Alira is your choice, then Alira is your choice. He said her name the way one might say the name of an unexpected illness, something inconvenient and unwelcome that had nonetheless arrived and now had to be dealt with. Alira felt the familiar sting of it, the reminder that even now, even in this impossible moment, she was still being discussed as a problem rather than a person. Kalen turned to her fully then, and for the first time since he had walked through the parting crowd on his black horse, his expression softened, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. "You have said nothing," he said quietly, quiet enough that it felt almost private, though she knew every wolf in the hall was still watching, still listening, still trying to make sense of what was happening. "Do you object to this?" The question startled her more than anything else that had happened so far. No one had ever asked her opinion about anything that mattered. Not in this hall, not in this pack, not in this life. She had been told what to wear, where to stand, when to speak and when to disappear, for as long as she could remember. And now a king she had never met, a man with blood still drying on his sleeve, was asking whether she objected to becoming his wife, as though her answer might actually change something. "I don't understand why you chose me," she said, because it was the truest thing she had to offer. "I have nothing to give you, no training, no standing, nothing that would benefit your kingdom or your alliance. That is not what I asked." "No," she admitted, "it isn't." "Then answer the question I asked." She looked at him properly then, past the exhaustion and the authority and the cold winter color of his eyes, searching for some hint of mockery, some sign that this was an elaborate cruelty, designed to humiliate her, in front of the entire pack. She found none. Whatever else was happening, whatever strange calculation had led him to her, instead of Marisol or Clarice or any of the other daughters arranged so carefully at the front of the hall, he seemed entirely, unsettlingly sincere. "I do not object," she said finally. "I am only confused." "Confusion I can work with," Kalen said, and something in his voice, some faint trace of dry humor, made her wonder for the first time if there was a person underneath all that authority, someone who might, under different circumstances, have been easy to talk to. Objection would have been more difficult. The ceremony that followed happened in a blur Alira could barely process. There were words spoken by an elder she had known her whole life but could not focus on now, a binding sworn between packs, a formal acknowledgement that Alira Voss would leave with the Crimson Wolves at dawn to become the wife of Alpha King Kalen Draven. Through all of it, she felt strangely disconnected from her own body, as though she were watching the scene from somewhere above the hall, rather than living it, watching a stranger with her face agree to a future she had never once imagined for herself. When it was finally over, when the elder had finished speaking, and the hall had erupted into a murmur of shocked conversation that no one bothered to lower for her benefit, Celine approached her, with an expression Alira had never seen her wear before. Not anger, not disdain. Something colder. "You will not embarrass this family," Celine said, low enough that only Alira could hear. "Whatever game he is playing, whatever reason he had for choosing you over girls with actual worth, you will conduct yourself with dignity in his court. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Alira said, though she understood very little of what was actually happening to her life in that moment. Marisol appeared beside her mother, a moment later, her carefully composed expression cracking at the edges, to reveal something raw and furious underneath. "Enjoy your kingdom," she said, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. "I'm sure it's some kind of mistake he'll correct once he realizes what he actually chose." "Maybe," Alira said quietly, because she genuinely believed it might be true. She spent what remained of that night in her small room at the edge of the family house, packing the few belongings she actually owned into a single worn traveling bag, while her mind raced through every possible explanation for what had happened. Pity, she decided, was the most likely answer. Perhaps Kalen had noticed something in her expression, some flicker of humiliation as the other daughters were presented, and chosen her out of some misplaced sense of compassion, a king's grand gesture toward the girl everyone else had overlooked. But that explanation did not sit right either. Not when she remembered the intensity in his gaze, the way he had studied her face, as though searching for something specific, something he had expected to find and been relieved, or perhaps unsettled, to actually see there. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts sometime near midnight. She opened it to find Nora, one of the household's older servants, a woman who had shown Alira more genuine kindness over the years than anyone else in that house. "I heard what happened," Nora said, stepping inside and closing the door softly behind her. "The whole pack is talking about nothing else." "I imagine they are," Alira said, folding a worn shawl into her bag. "Are you frightened?" Alira considered the question honestly, before answering. "I don't know what I am. Confused, mostly. And a little afraid, yes. I don't know anything about him, or his kingdom, or what he actually wants from me." Nora was quiet for a moment, her weathered face thoughtful. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old bloodlines," she said finally. "Wolves marked by something the rest of us couldn't see, something that mattered more than beauty or standing. She said the packs used to search for those bloodlines the way people search for gold, quietly, carefully, because finding one could change everything." "You think that's what this is about? Some old bloodline?" "I think," Nora said, "that a king does not travel this far, lose men in an attack, and then choose a bride on a whim. Whatever he saw in you tonight, child, I do not believe it was an accident." Alira turned the words over in her mind, long after Nora left, long after the house had gone quiet, and the fire in her small hearth had burned down to embers. She did not sleep. She sat by the window instead, watching the eastern sky slowly lighten toward dawn, and wondered what kind of life was waiting for her beyond the borders of the only home she had ever known. When morning finally came, she found Kaelin already waiting near the edge of the territory, mounted on his black horse, flanked by a small contingent of his own warriors. He did not smile when she approached, but something in his expression eased slightly, as though he had genuinely wondered whether she would come at all. "You're ready," he said. It was not quite a question. "As ready as I can be," Alira answered honestly. He extended a hand toward her, and she took it, allowing him to help her onto the horse behind him, her small bag of belongings tied to the saddle. As they rode away from Moonfall territory, away from the only life she had ever known, she glanced back once at the pack house where she had spent so many years feeling invisible, and found she felt no grief at leaving it behind, only a strange, quiet anticipation for whatever waited ahead. She did not yet know that the true reason for Kaelin's choice had nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with a bloodline older than either of their kingdoms, a bloodline that would soon place her at the center of a danger neither of them could fully imagine. The ride to the Crimson Wolves' territory took the better part of 2 days, through forests that grew thicker and older the further they traveled, until the trees themselves seemed to lean inward, as though listening to every word spoken beneath their branches. Alira said little during the journey, unsure of what to ask or whether questions were even welcome. But Kaelin surprised her more than once by breaking the silence himself, offering small observations about the land they passed through, the history of a crumbling watchtower, the reason a particular river had been diverted generations ago to protect a village from flooding. He was not, she began to realize, the cold and distant figure she had expected a king to be. He was careful with his words, deliberate in a way that suggested he had learned long ago that carelessness carried consequences he could not always undo. But beneath that careful exterior there was warmth too, small flashes of it, a dry comment here, a genuine question there, moments where she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite name. They reached the gates of his kingdom on the evening of the second day, and Alira found herself unprepared for the sheer scale of it. Moonfall's territory had always felt modest to her, a scattering of homes around a central hall, comfortable but unremarkable. The Crimson Wolves' seat of power was something else entirely, a fortress of dark stone rising against the mountainside, its walls lined with torches that stretched up into the twilight like a river of fire, its gates guarded by warriors who bowed their heads the moment Kaelin's horse approached. Word of his choice had apparently traveled faster than they had, because the moment they passed through the gates, Alira felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes settle on her, courtiers and guards and servants alike, pausing in their tasks to study the woman their Alpha King had chosen. She kept her chin level and her expression composed, remembering Nora's parting words, remembering that whatever happened next, She would not give this court the satisfaction of watching her crumble. "This way," Kaelin said, helping her down from the horse in the main courtyard. "You'll be shown to your chambers. Tomorrow, once you've rested, we'll discuss what comes next." "What comes next?" Alira repeated. "You mean the wedding?" Something flickered across his face, there and gone, so quickly she almost missed it. "Among other things," he said, and before she could press further, he had turned to speak with one of his guards, leaving her standing alone in the courtyard, with more questions than she had arrived with. A woman approached her a moment later, introducing herself as Ivy, one of the castle's senior attendants, tasked with settling Alira into her new quarters. Ivy was kind in a brisk, efficient way, guiding Alira through corridors lined with old tapestries and past rooms that seemed to stretch on forever, until they reached a chamber near the eastern tower, spacious and elegant in a manner Alira had never experienced in her life. "The Alpha King requested you have the room with the best view of the eastern ridge," Ivy said, drawing back heavy curtains to reveal a window overlooking mountains, turning gold in the last light of the setting sun. "He said you'd appreciate it." Alira frowned slightly at that. "He doesn't know anything about what I appreciate. We only met yesterday." Ivy gave her a curious look, one that suggested she knew something Alira did not, but said nothing further on the subject, moving instead to lay out fresh clothing and explain the castle's routines for the days ahead. Alira thanked her and, once alone, spent a long while simply standing at the window, watching the mountains darken, trying to make sense of a life that had changed so completely in the span of 2 days. Sleep came easier than she expected that first night, exhaustion from the journey overtaking her uncertainty, but she woke before dawn, to the sound of voices drifting up from somewhere below her window. Curious, and unable to fall back asleep, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crept closer to listen, catching fragments of a conversation between 2 guards stationed near the base of the tower. "Still can't believe he chose her," one voice was saying. "After everything, after losing 2 men in that attack, he comes home and picks some pack girl nobody's ever heard of." "There's talk it's not just a girl," the other voice replied, lower, more cautious. "Talk that the elders have been searching for something specific for years. A bloodline. You know the old stories." "Stories are stories." "Maybe, but the Alpha King doesn't do anything without a reason. Never has. If he chose her, it wasn't for her pretty face. That much I'll wager." The voices moved on, fading into the general murmur of the waking castle, but Alira remained by her window for a long time afterward, turning the words over in her mind. A bloodline, the same word Nora had used back home. It was the second time in as many days someone had suggested there was more to Kaelin's choice than simple attraction or impulse, and the more she heard it, the more it settled into her chest, like a stone she could not shake loose. She spent the following days in a strange limbo, treated with polite deference by the castle staff, but held at a careful distance by the court itself. She was given new clothing, finer than anything she had owned before, and instructed in small matters of etiquette she would be expected to know as the future wife of an Alpha King. But no one, not Ivy, not the tutors assigned to guide her, not even Kaelin himself during the brief moments they crossed paths, offered any real explanation for why she had been chosen. It was during one such moment, wandering the castle's east wing after a lesson had ended early, that she stumbled upon the library. She had not intended to explore that far from her assigned rooms, but the door to the library stood ajar, and the sight of towering shelves lined with ancient volumes drew her forward with an interest she could not resist. She had always loved reading, one of the few pleasures her stepmother had never managed to take from her entirely, and the sheer scale of the collection before her was more books than she had seen gathered in one place in her entire life. She wandered between the shelves for nearly an hour, running her fingers along cracked leather spines, before a particular section near the back of the room caught her attention. The books here were older than the rest, their covers worn soft with age, their titles faded almost past reading. One volume in particular, bound in dark red leather, with a symbol embossed on its cover that resembled an eye surrounded by crescent moons, seemed to call to her in a way she could not explain. She pulled it from the shelf carefully and opened it to a random page, squinting at handwriting so old and cramped it took her several minutes to decipher even a few lines. What she found made her breath catch. The passage spoke of a bloodline called the Unmarked, wolves born without the visible signs of pack lineage that other wolves carried. Wolves who appeared, to untrained eyes, entirely ordinary. The text described how this bloodline had once held the power to strengthen the ancient wards protecting the northern kingdoms from a darkness that lived beyond their borders, a darkness the old wolves called only the Hollow. But the unmarked bloodline had grown rare over generations, hunted nearly to extinction by enemies who understood, better than the packs themselves, what power those wolves actually carried. Elira's hands trembled slightly as she turned the fragile pages, reading further, absorbing details about markings that only appeared under moonlight, about a scent that other wolves described as unusually clean, untouched by the usual traces of pack magic that marked every other bloodline. She thought of the way Kaelin's eyes had found her instantly in that crowded hall, the way he had asked her name before anyone else had spoken a word, the way the guards outside her window had spoken of the elders searching for something specific. You shouldn't be reading that. The voice came from the doorway, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the book. She turned to find Kaelin standing there, his expression unreadable, watching her with an intensity that made her suddenly very aware of the volume still open in her hands. I found it by accident, she said, though she made no move to close it. It talks about a bloodline, the unmarked, wolves without visible pack markings, wolves who… She stopped, watching his face carefully. This is about me, isn't it? This is why you chose me. Kaelin was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Elira felt the last of her uncertainty crystallize into something closer to understanding, and something closer, too, to hurt. Yes, he said finally. It's time we talked properly about what you are, and why I need you. The word need settled over Elira like cold water, and she found herself gripping the old book a little tighter, as though it might steady her against whatever was coming next. Sit, Kaelin said, gesturing toward a pair of chairs near the library's tall window. This deserves a proper explanation, and you deserve to hear it from me, rather than a book written centuries before either of us was born. She sat, though her body remained tense, every instinct on alert. Kaelin lowered himself into the chair across from her, and for a moment, he simply looked at her, studying her face with the same intensity he had shown that first night in the Moonfall Hall. The night I met you, he began, I traveled to your territory, expecting to choose a bride for reasons of politics alone. An alliance, nothing more. I had no expectation of finding anything unusual among Moonfall's daughters. But the moment I walked into that hall, I caught your scent before I ever saw your face. My scent, Elira repeated, uncertain. Wolves carry traces of their pack's magic in their scent, Kaelin explained. It's subtle, something most wolves never consciously notice, but an alpha trained to sense such things can detect it easily enough. Every wolf in that hall carried the particular signature of Moonfall's bloodline, generations of pack magic woven into their very being. Every wolf, except you. Elira frowned. I don't understand what that means. It means your scent was clean, Kaelin said. Unmarked, as though you belonged to no pack magic at all. Or rather, as though you belonged to something older, something that predates the bloodlines most packs carry today. He gestured toward the book still resting in her lap. You've already read enough to understand the basics. The unmarked bloodline is not a myth, Elira. It's real, and exceedingly rare, and I believe you carry it. Because of how I smell, she said, unable to keep a note of disbelief from her voice. Because of how you smell, yes, but also because of something else. Kaelin leaned forward slightly. The ancient wards that protect the northern kingdoms from a threat called the Hollow have been weakening for years. My scholars have studied every text available to us, searching for a way to restore them, and every single account agrees on one point. Only the blood of the unmarked can renew wards of that nature. Without it, the barrier will fail eventually, and when it fails, the Hollow will not stay contained to whatever lies beyond it. Elira sat back slowly, processing the weight of what he was telling her. So you didn't choose me because you wanted a wife, she said quietly. You chose me because you need my blood for some kind of ritual. That's not, Kaelin started, then stopped himself, visibly reconsidering his words. It's not that simple. It sounds simple enough to me. She stood abruptly, setting the old book down on the small table between them, with more force than necessary. You said she's mine, in front of an entire hall of people who already thought I was worthless, and I believed, for one foolish moment, that you saw something in me. But you didn't see me at all, did you? You saw a bloodline, a tool for your wards. I will not pretend the timing was simple, or that my reasons were purely sentimental, Kalen said, rising to his feet as well, his voice steady, but edged with something that might have been frustration, or might have been regret. I would be lying to you if I claimed otherwise, and I have no intention of lying to you. Not about this. My kingdom is facing a threat that could destroy everything and everyone within it, and when I realized what you might be, I made a choice to bring you here, rather than risk losing that chance entirely. How reassuring, Elira said, though the bitterness in her own voice surprised her. But that is not the only reason I chose you, Kalen continued, his tone quieter now, more careful. I could have brought you here as a prisoner, or a hostage, or simply demanded your blood through whatever means necessary, once I understood what you might be. I did none of those things. I chose you as my wife, publicly, in front of your entire pack, because I believed you deserved dignity in this, whatever else it might cost my own comfort or convenience. Elira wanted to argue further, wanted to hold on to her anger because it felt safer than the alternative, but something in his words gave her pause. He was not entirely wrong. A king with less patience, less restraint, could have simply taken what he needed and discarded the rest. He had not done that. You could have told me the truth from the start, she said finally, some of the sharp edge fading from her voice. Instead of letting me wonder, letting me imagine every possible explanation, except the real one. You're right, Kalen admitted. I should have. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth is, I was uncertain how to explain something so strange, to someone who had every reason to distrust me already. That was a mistake, and I apologize for it. The apology, simple as it was, disarmed her more than any elaborate justification could have. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for insincerity, and finding none, only the same tired honesty she had noticed in him since that very first night. What happens now? She asked. If I truly carry this bloodline, what is it you expect me to do? Nothing, yet, Kalen said. The wards require a ritual that has not been performed in generations, and even my scholars are uncertain of every detail involved. Before anything else, we need to confirm what you are, and if the bloodline is confirmed, you would need training to control whatever power comes with it. It would not be safe, for you, or for anyone around you, to attempt anything without proper preparation. And if I refuse, Elira said, if I decide I want no part in any of this, the wards, the ritual, any of it. Kalen was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. Then I would not force you, he said. Whatever else I am not a man who takes by force what should be given freely. If you refuse, my kingdom will have to find another solution, and I will have to live with the consequences of that. But I hope, in time, you will choose to help us. Not because I demand it, but because you understand what is at stake. Elira turned the old book over in her hands, tracing the faded symbol on its cover, the eye surrounded by crescent moons. She thought of Moonfall, of her stepmother's cold dismissals, of a lifetime spent believing she was worth nothing to anyone. And here was a king, telling her she might be worth everything to an entire kingdom, and yet somehow that revelation felt less like triumph, and more like an enormous, unwelcome weight settling onto shoulders that had never carried anything of consequence before. I need time, she said finally, to think about all of this. You have it, Kalen said, as much time as you need. She left the library that evening with more questions than she had arrived with, but for the first time since the choosing ceremony, she felt as though she finally understood the shape of the mystery surrounding her, even if she did not yet understand what she intended to do about it. Over the following days, she found herself drawn back to that library, again and again, poring over the old texts with a hunger she had not expected, learning everything she could about the unmarked bloodline, about the hollow that threatened the northern kingdoms, about ancient rituals half forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars. Kalen often joined her during these sessions, answering questions when he could, admitting ignorance when he could not, and slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, the careful distance between them began to narrow. It was during one such evening, as autumn rain drummed steadily against the library's tall windows, that Elira finally found the passage that confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly what she was. The text described a specific marking that appeared only on true bearers of the unmarked bloodline, a faint silver pattern visible solely under direct moonlight, resembling delicate frost spreading across skin. Elira set the book down slowly, her heart hammering, and glanced toward the window where a break in the clouds revealed a sliver of moon, breaking through the storm. She rose, moved toward the light, and turned her bare forearm toward the window. There, faint but unmistakable, silver lines bloomed across her skin, like frost across glass, delicate and beautiful, and entirely undeniable. She was exactly what Kaelin believed her to be. Elira stared at the silver markings on her arm until the clouds shifted again and swallowed the moon whole, and the delicate frost-like pattern faded back into ordinary skin, as though it had never been there at all. She lowered her arm slowly, her mind racing, her body suddenly cold despite the warmth of the library's hearth fire. She did not tell Kaelin that night. She needed time to sit with the discovery alone first, to turn it over in her mind without the added weight of his reaction, whatever that reaction might be. She returned to her chambers and sat by the window until the storm passed entirely, watching for the moon to reappear, testing the marking again and again as though it might vanish permanently if she looked away for too long. It did not vanish. Each time the clear night sky allowed moonlight to touch her skin, the silver pattern bloomed again, delicate and undeniable, proof of a truth she had spent her entire life never suspecting about herself. She told Kaelin the following morning, meeting him in a small private study near his chambers rather than the library, where the risk of servants overhearing felt too great for a conversation this significant. He listened to her description of the marking without visible surprise, though something in his expression eased, as though a tension he had been carrying quietly for days had finally released. "You suspected already," she said, watching his face carefully. "I hoped," he corrected. "There's a difference. Suspicion is not the same as certainty, and I did not want to burden you with expectations before you had a chance to discover the truth yourself. And now that it's confirmed, now we begin properly," Kaelin said. "Training. Understanding what you're capable of, at a pace that keeps you safe. I will not rush this, Elira. Whatever the wards need, they will not need it so urgently that we risk harming you to get it faster." True to his word, the weeks that followed settled into a careful rhythm of instruction and discovery. Kaelin personally oversaw much of her training, alongside an elderly scholar named Colton, who had spent decades studying the old texts and proved endlessly patient with Elira's questions, even the ones that revealed how little she understood about the magic apparently running through her own blood. The training was slower and stranger than she expected. There were no dramatic displays of power in those early sessions, no bursts of light or sudden transformations. Instead, Colton had her sit quietly for hours at a time, teaching her to notice small things, the way her skin warmed faintly under moonlight even indoors, the way certain old symbols seemed to hum faintly beneath her fingertips when she traced them, sensations so subtle she would have dismissed them entirely before understanding what to look for. "The unmarked bloodline does not work like ordinary pack magic," Colton explained one afternoon, as autumn rain streaked the study windows, and Elira practiced tracing a warding symbol onto parchment for what felt like the 100th time. "Most pack magic is inherited strength, passed down and used much as any other physical trait. Your bloodline is different. It is a connection, a channel, between the wearer and the old wards themselves. Power does not simply exist within you waiting to be unleashed. It exists in the connection you can form with something far older and larger than yourself. That sounds considerably more complicated than simply being strong," Elira said, rubbing at her tired eyes. "It is," Colton agreed, with the faint trace of a smile, "which is precisely why it takes patience to learn, and precisely why the Alpha King insisted we take our time with you, rather than rushing toward the ritual before you understood what you were doing." Elira glanced toward Kaelin, who stood near the window observing the lesson, as he often did, his expression thoughtful. He caught her gaze and offered a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that seemed to say he trusted her progress, even when she herself felt frustrated by how slowly it was coming. It was during these long hours of study and quiet instruction that Elira found herself, almost without noticing, growing genuinely comfortable in Kaelin's presence. He was not the cold, distant king the rest of the court seemed to believe him to be. In private, away from the watching eyes of nobles and guards, he asked thoughtful questions, offered dry observations that occasionally startled a laugh out of her, and listened, truly listened, when she spoke, in a way no one in her life ever had before. "You're smiling," he observed one evening. As they walked together along a covered walkway overlooking the castle's eastern gardens, the autumn air crisp and sharp around them. "That's new." "Is it?" Elira said, though she felt her cheeks warm slightly at being caught in such an unguarded moment. "At Moonfall, you barely spoke, unless someone forced a word from you. Here, you argue with Colton about the correct pronunciation of 300-year-old warding chants, and laugh when he gets flustered, trying to correct you." "Maybe I simply feel less like I need to disappear here," Elira admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "At home, disappearing kept me safe. My stepmother had very specific ideas about what I was allowed to be, and none of those ideas included taking up space, or having opinions, or laughing too loudly at anything." Kalen was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim evening light. "That sounds like a very lonely way to live." "It was," Elira said simply. "I didn't realize how lonely until I stopped living it." They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of the conversation settling gently between them rather than pressing down uncomfortably, and Elira found herself, not for the first time, wondering what exactly was growing between them beneath the careful surface of duty and training and ancient bloodlines. It did not feel like the arrangement of convenience she had expected when she first arrived at his kingdom. It felt like something else entirely, something she was not entirely sure she was ready to name. "May I ask you something?" she said finally, breaking the silence. "Of course. If I had not carried this bloodline," she said carefully, watching his face for any flicker of hesitation, "would you still have chosen me that night? Or was it only ever about what you sensed in my scent?" Kalen stopped walking, turning to face her fully, and for a long moment he seemed to be searching for the right words, weighing them carefully before speaking, the way he weighed most things. "I have asked myself that same question many times since that night," he admitted. "And I will not insult you by pretending the answer is simple. The bloodline is why I noticed you at all, that much is true. But it is not why I have continued to seek out your company these past weeks, or why I find myself looking forward to these evenings more than I would ever admit to my own counsel." "That's not quite an answer," Elira said, though something in her chest had loosened slightly at his words. "No," Kalen agreed. "It isn't. Because I don't yet know the full answer myself, Elira. I only know that whatever began as duty has become something I no longer fully understand, and something I am no longer certain I want to give up, bloodline or not." The honesty of it startled her, coming from a man who guarded his words as carefully as he guarded his kingdom, and she found she had no ready response to offer in return, only the quiet, unfamiliar warmth of being seen, truly seen, by someone who had every reason to view her merely as a solution to a political problem. They resumed walking a moment later, the conversation shifting to lighter matters, but something had changed between them in that exchange, some careful barrier lowered just enough to let genuine feeling through. Elira found herself thinking about his words long after they parted for the evening, turning them over in her mind, the same way she turned over the old texts in the library, searching for meaning she was not entirely certain she was ready to find. She did not yet know that within the castle walls, jealousy and ambition were already conspiring against her. That word of her growing bond with Kalen had reached ears eager to see her fail, and that the quiet peace of these autumn evenings would not last nearly as long as she hoped. The letter arrived at the castle on a gray morning 3 weeks later, carried by a Moonfall messenger who requested an audience with Elira alone. She received him in one of the smaller sitting rooms near her chambers, curiosity and unease mingling in equal measure, as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the parchment inside. The handwriting belonged to Marisol. The letter was brief, formal in a way that felt entirely unlike her stepsister's usual manner, announcing that Marisol had been invited to the Crimson Court by a nobleman named Garrick, one of Kalen's own advisors, who had apparently met her during a diplomatic visit to Moonfall some months prior. She would be arriving within the week to take up residence at court, the letter explained, as Garrick's intended companion. Elira read the letter twice, searching for some hidden meaning beneath its polite surface, and found only unease growing steadily in her chest. Marisol had never done anything without calculation. If she had found her way into the Crimson Court, it was not by accident, and Elira doubted very much that the timing, so soon after Elira's own arrival, was coincidental. She mentioned the letter to Kalen that evening, watching his expression carefully, as she explained who Marisol was, and the nature of their strained relationship. Garrick, Kaelin said, his brow furrowing slightly at the name. He has been pushing for closer ties with several of the smaller packs recently, arguing that the kingdom needs broader alliances, given the current unrest along our borders. I did not realize Moonfall was among the packs he had been courting. She will not be kind to me, Elira said plainly. Whatever her reasons for coming here, I doubt goodwill toward me is among them. Then we will be careful, Kaelin said. But I will not turn away a guest without cause, Elira. Not without giving her the chance to prove your concerns wrong. That would only strengthen whatever narrative she might wish to spread about unfair treatment. Elira understood the logic, even as it left her uneasy. Kaelin was right that refusing Marisol entry without clear justification would only make Elira appear petty and insecure in the eyes of the court, exactly the kind of weakness her stepsister would exploit without hesitation. Still, she could not shake the feeling that Marisol's arrival marked the beginning of something far more complicated than a simple family rivalry transplanted to new soil. Marisol arrived precisely 1 week later, and Elira watched from a window overlooking the main courtyard as her stepsister descended from a carriage, dressed in finery, clearly chosen to impress, her dark hair perfectly arranged, her expression composed into careful, practiced warmth. Garrick greeted her with obvious pleasure, and the assembled court, curious about the new arrival, gathered close enough to observe the introduction with open interest. Elira did not go down to greet her immediately, choosing instead to wait until the initial fuss had settled before making her way to the main hall, where she found Marisol already holding court among a small cluster of noblewomen, laughing lightly at something one of them had said, appearing entirely at ease in surroundings that had overwhelmed Elira herself during her first weeks at the castle. "Elira," Marisol said, spotting her across the hall, her smile widening in a way that did not quite reach her eyes. "How wonderful to see you again. You look well." "Marisol," Elira replied, keeping her own tone carefully neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here so soon." "Fate has a strange sense of humor, doesn't it?" Marisol said, glancing meaningfully at the gathered courtiers around her. "First you're swept away by a king, and now I find myself equally fortunate, courted by one of his most trusted advisors. Perhaps there's more to the Voss name than anyone at Moonfall ever gave us credit for." The comment was delivered lightly enough that anyone listening might have mistaken it for genuine warmth, but Elira caught the edge beneath it immediately, the subtle reminder that Marisol intended to establish herself as an equal within this court, not as Elira's inferior, regardless of the circumstances that had brought each of them there. Over the following weeks, Marisol proved remarkably skilled at winning favor throughout the castle, charming nobles and servants alike with a warmth that Elira knew, from years of experience, was almost entirely performance. She attended every court function with practiced grace, offered compliments and small kindnesses to precisely the right people, and slowly began weaving herself into the fabric of court life in a way that left Elira feeling, uncomfortably, as though she were the newcomer despite having arrived first. Whispers began to circulate soon after, subtle at first, questioning why the Alpha King had chosen a plain, untrained girl from the back of a hall, when a more polished, more socially adept option had apparently been available all along. Elira heard fragments of these conversations in passing, servants murmuring in corridors, noblewomen exchanging glances during court gatherings, and though she told herself the whispers meant nothing, they wore at her confidence in ways she had not anticipated. "You seem troubled," Colton observed one afternoon, during a training session that Elira had spent more time staring blankly at a warding symbol than actually studying it. "It's nothing," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. "It is clearly something," Colton said, setting down the old text he had been reviewing. "And whatever it is, it's affecting your focus. The bloodline responds to emotional clarity, Elira. If your mind is elsewhere, the connection will remain elsewhere as well." She sighed, rubbing at her temples. "There's a woman recently arrived at court, my stepsister actually. She has a talent for making people forget why I might belong here at all." "Ah," Colton said, understanding dawning in his expression. "The court gossip has reached even my old ears. I would not concern yourself too greatly with idle talk, child. The Alpha King's choice was not made lightly, and those who whisper otherwise understand very little about what actually transpired that night." "They don't need to understand it," Elira said. "They only need to believe their own version of events strongly enough." Colton studied her for a long moment before speaking again. then perhaps the answer is not to worry about what others believe, but to become so certain of your own worth that their whispers lose their power entirely. Easier said than done, I grant you, but no less true for it. Elira turned his words over in her mind long after the lesson ended, trying to find comfort in them, even as Marisol's continued presence at court made such comfort difficult to hold on to. Matters grew more complicated still when, during a formal dinner held to welcome several visiting dignitaries, Marisol maneuvered herself into a seat directly across from Kaelin, engaging him in lively conversation about matters of trade and diplomacy that left Elira, seated slightly further down the table, struggling to follow topics she had never been trained to discuss. She watched Kaelin respond to Marisol's questions with polite interest, nothing more. Nothing that suggested any romantic inclination whatsoever, but the sight still stirred something uncomfortable in her chest, an old, familiar insecurity she thought she had begun to leave behind during her weeks at the castle. You were quiet at dinner, Kaelin said later that evening, finding her in the library where she had retreated after the meal concluded. I had little to contribute, Elira said, not looking up from the book in front of her, though she was not actually reading a word of it. Marisol has always been better suited to conversations of that nature. Marisol asked several intelligent questions about grain tariffs, Kaelin said, settling into the chair across from her. It was, admittedly, a reasonably engaging discussion. It was also entirely forgettable within an hour of it ending. Elira glanced up at him, uncertain how to interpret the comment. I have sat through countless dinners filled with clever conversation and forgotten every word of it by morning. Kaelin continued. What I remember, Elira, are the evenings spent in this library, arguing with Colton about pronunciation, or walking the gardens discussing loneliness and disappearing. Those conversations stay with me in ways clever dinner talk never has. You don't need to say that simply to make me feel better, Elira said, though something in her chest had eased slightly at his words. I'm not, Kaelin said simply. I am saying it because it's true. Whatever whispers are circulating through this court, and I am aware of them, believe me, they do not change what I have come to understand about you these past weeks. Marisol may be skilled at winning favor quickly, but favor won quickly is rarely favor that lasts, and I have never been particularly interested in things that don't last. Elira wanted to believe him fully, wanted to let his words settle the uncertainty that had been growing in her chest since Marisol's arrival, but some old, deeply ingrained instinct warned her that matters were far from finished. Marisol had never simply accepted a loss quietly, not once in all the years Elira had known her, and something told her that whatever quiet game her stepsister was currently playing, it was only the opening move in a far larger and more dangerous scheme. She did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be, or how soon the true depth of Marisol's ambitions would reveal itself in ways that threatened far more than mere court gossip. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the mountainside fortress in a hard, glittering frost that made the training sessions in the eastern courtyard considerably less comfortable than they had been during the milder autumn weeks. Elira found herself, despite the cold, looking forward to these sessions more than almost anything else in her new life, not merely because of the slow progress she was finally beginning to make with her abilities, but because Kaelin had started attending nearly every one of them personally, setting aside matters of state that Elira suspected his advisors found increasingly frustrating. You're improving, Colton observed one bitter morning, watching as Elira successfully traced a warding symbol into a patch of fresh snow, the lines glowing faintly silver before fading back into ordinary frost. 3 months ago, you could barely sense the connection at all. Now you're forming symbols with reasonable consistency. Reasonable, Elira repeated, a little breathless from the effort. That's a generous word for what just happened. I am a scholar, not a flatterer, Colton said, though his eyes crinkled with something like pride. Reasonable is precisely the word I intend. Kaelin, who had been observing from the edge of the courtyard, stepped forward to examine the symbol more closely before it faded entirely. This is the same pattern from the 3rd chapter of the binding texts, he said. The one meant to test a connection's stability before attempting anything more significant. Colton's idea, Elira said. He thought it best to test whether I could sustain a connection reliably before moving toward anything involving the actual wards. A wise precaution, Kaelin agreed, though something in his expression suggested his thoughts had already moved elsewhere, toward matters heavier than a simple training exercise. You're worried, Elira said, studying his face. The wards weakened further last week, Kalen admitted, his voice lower now, meant only for her and Colton to hear. A section along the northern border nearly failed entirely before my warriors managed to reinforce it manually. It held, but only barely, and only temporarily. We do not have unlimited time to prepare you properly, Alira, much as I wish otherwise. The words settled heavily over the courtyard, and Alira felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, the knowledge that an entire kingdom's safety rested, at least in part, on how quickly she could master abilities she had only discovered existed a few short months earlier. Then we should increase the pace of training, she said, though a flicker of fear accompanied the words. Whatever it takes. Not recklessly, Kalen said firmly. I will not risk your safety merely to move faster than is wise. But yes, we should discuss increasing the intensity of your lessons, within reason. Colton nodded slowly, already turning the matter over in his mind. There is a more advanced exercise I have hesitated to introduce, he said. One that would allow Alira to draw briefly on a small fragment of the ward's own power, testing her connection, under conditions closer to what an actual ritual would require. It carries more risk than what we have practiced so far, but it would also tell us a great deal more about how prepared she truly is. Then let's begin, Alira said, before either man could voice further hesitation on her behalf. The exercise, when Colton finally walked her through its preparation 2 days later, proved considerably more demanding than anything she had attempted before. It required her to stand at the edge of the northern boundary itself, close enough to feel the faint, ancient hum of the ward's remaining power, and to attempt drawing a small fragment of that power into herself, testing whether her bloodline could sustain such a connection without becoming overwhelmed by it. If you feel any pain beyond ordinary strain, Colton instructed, standing close beside her with his weathered hands raised and ready to intervene if necessary, you release the connection immediately. Do you understand? There is no shame in stopping early. There is considerable danger in pushing too far. I understand, Alira said, though her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination as she closed her eyes and reached toward the faint, ancient hum she had learned to sense over months of careful practice. The connection, when it came, arrived with far more force than anything she had experienced during her earlier lessons. Power surged through her, ancient and vast, carrying with it fragments of sensation she could not fully interpret, cold and heat simultaneously, light and shadow woven together, the overwhelming awareness of something enormous pressing against a boundary that had grown dangerously thin. She gasped, her knees threatening to buckle, and felt Kalen's arm catch her before she fully registered that she had begun to fall. Release it, Colton said urgently. Now, Alira. She forced herself to let go of the connection, pulling her awareness back from that vast, ancient hum with considerable effort, and the sudden absence of it left her feeling strangely hollow, as though she had been holding her breath for far longer than she realized, and had only now remembered to exhale. Are you hurt? Kalen asked, still holding her steady, his expression tight with concern. I'm all right, she managed, though her voice shook slightly. Just overwhelmed. There was so much more there than I expected. It felt alive, almost, aware. Colton frowned thoughtfully at her description. The old texts do describe the wards as having a kind of dormant consciousness, though most scholars dismiss that as poetic exaggeration rather than literal truth. If what you felt was genuine awareness, that raises questions I had not previously considered. Questions for another day, Kalen said firmly, still watching Alira with obvious concern. For now, she needs rest. He insisted on walking her back to her chambers personally, despite her protests that she was capable of managing the short distance herself. And something in his quiet insistence, the careful way he kept one hand near her elbow in case she stumbled, warmed her chest in a manner entirely separate from the exhaustion of the exercise itself. You didn't need to accompany me, she said, once they reached her chamber door. I'm truly fine, Kalen. I know, he said. I wanted to anyway. The simple honesty of the admission left her momentarily speechless, and she found herself studying his face in the dim corridor light, searching for something she was becoming increasingly certain she had already found weeks ago, if only she had allowed herself to recognize it sooner. Kalen, she said quietly, may I ask you something honestly, and would you answer just as honestly in return? Always, he said. Do you care for me? She asked. Or do you care for what I represent to your kingdom? I need to know the difference, truly know it, before I let myself feel anything further than I already do. Kaelan was quiet for a long moment, his expression unusually vulnerable, in a way she had rarely witnessed from him, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that left no room for doubt. I have spent my entire life being what my kingdom needed me to be, he said. A warrior when they needed strength, a negotiator when they needed peace, a king when they needed leadership, regardless of what I personally wanted or felt in any given moment. When I chose you that night, I told myself it was purely a matter of necessity, the bloodline, the wards, nothing more complicated than simple duty. He paused, reaching up to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering there a moment longer than duty alone would ever require. But somewhere in these past months, Illyra, duty stopped being the reason I looked forward to seeing you. I care for you, not for what you represent to my kingdom, though I will not pretend that matters less to me than perhaps it should. I care for the woman who argues with Colton about pronunciation, who laughed for the first time in the gardens and looked genuinely surprised by her own laughter, who asked me honestly just now whether my feelings were real, rather than simply assuming the worst and walking away. Illyra felt her eyes sting unexpectedly at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion or the lingering strain of her earlier training exercise. I care for you too, she admitted quietly, more than I expected to, given how all of this began. Kaelan smiled then, a genuine, unguarded expression she had rarely seen grace his face during his more formal duties as king, and for a long moment, they simply stood together in the quiet corridor, the weight of the day's exhausting lesson, forgotten entirely in the warmth of a mutual admission neither of them had been quite ready to voice until now. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows further down the corridor, nor understood how quickly that private moment of honesty would be twisted into a weapon by those determined to see Illyra fail, regardless of the cost. The figure in the shadows belonged to one of Garrick's own attendants, a quiet young man named Silas who had proven, over the preceding weeks, remarkably useful to Marisol's growing ambitions at court. He reported what he had witnessed that night, with careful precision, and Marisol listened with an expression that grew colder and more calculating with every detail he provided. They care for each other, she repeated, her voice flat with barely suppressed frustration. Genuinely then. Not merely duty after all. It appeared that way, yes, Silas confirmed. Marisol dismissed him with a sharp gesture and sat alone in her chambers for a long while afterward, turning the information over in her mind, searching for some angle she had not yet considered. She had come to the Crimson Court expecting, at minimum, to outshine her stepsister socially, to prove to the entire kingdom that the Alpha King's choice had been foolish, easily corrected once he recognized the superior alternative standing right beside him. She had not expected genuine affection to complicate matters this significantly. It was Garrick, arriving later that evening with wine and a conspiratorial expression, who offered the solution she had been searching for. There are those within this kingdom, he said carefully, once he was certain they were entirely alone, who believe the Alpha King's fixation on this bloodline nonsense is dangerous rather than beneficial. Ancient magic, best left undisturbed, in their view. Powers that could easily turn against the very kingdom they claim to protect, given the wrong circumstances. You're suggesting Illyra's abilities are a threat, Marisol said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. I'm suggesting that certain individuals would be considerably more comfortable if the girl's connection to the wards was severed entirely, before any ritual could be attempted, Garrick said. And I believe, given your own considerable talents at persuasion, you might be uniquely positioned to help arrange such an outcome, in exchange for a rather significant improvement in your own standing at this court, once the matter is resolved. Marisol considered his words carefully, weighing ambition against whatever remained of her conscience, and found, without much genuine surprise, that ambition won easily. The plan, when it unfolded 3 weeks later, proved considerably more sophisticated than Illyra could have anticipated. Under the guise of a formal ritual meant to test her growing connection to the wards under Colton's careful supervision, several of Garrick's allies within the castle guard arranged to divert the elderly scholar's attention at a crucial moment, isolating Alira just long enough for a small group of Garrick's followers to attempt removing her from the castle grounds entirely, intending to transport her somewhere Kaelin's influence could not easily reach, somewhere they could ensure her connection to the ancient wards was permanently severed. Alira realized something was wrong the moment Colton failed to appear at their scheduled meeting near the northern boundary, replaced instead by two unfamiliar guards, claiming he had been called away on urgent business, and instructing her to wait in a small stone outbuilding near the boundary until he returned. The instinct that something felt deeply wrong settled into her stomach almost immediately, but by the time she moved to leave the outbuilding, the door had already been barred from the outside, and she found herself trapped, her pulse hammering as she realized precisely how thoroughly she had been maneuvered into isolation. "Let me out," she called, pounding against the heavy wooden door. "This isn't necessary. Whatever you've been told, whatever Garrick has promised you, this is a mistake." No response came, only the distant murmur of low voices discussing logistics she could not fully make out. Something about transportation, about timing, about ensuring the Alpha King remained occupied elsewhere until the matter was already settled. Alira forced herself to breathe, to think rather than panic, remembering the months of careful training she had undergone, the connection to the ancient wards that lived somewhere just beneath her skin, waiting to be called upon even now, even here, even in fear. She closed her eyes and reached for it, that familiar ancient hum she had learned to sense over countless careful lessons, and found, to her own surprise, that fear had sharpened rather than dulled her connection, the power responding to her urgency with an intensity she had never achieved during any of her controlled training exercises. The wooden door in front of her groaned, then splintered outward with a force that sent the guards standing beyond it stumbling backward in shock, and Alira stepped through the wreckage with silver light still faintly tracing patterns across her skin, her heart pounding, but her resolve steadier than she had expected it to be. "You should not have done that," one of the guards said, recovering his composure and reaching for her arm. Alira sidestepped him easily, years of instinct honed unconsciously by months of physical training alongside her magical lessons, and called out toward the castle, her voice carrying with a clarity and force that surprised even herself. Help arrived faster than the conspirators had anticipated. Kaelin, alerted by a servant who had noticed the unusual gathering of guards near the northern boundary and grown suspicious enough to investigate, arrived within minutes, alongside a contingent of his most trusted warriors, and the attempted abduction collapsed swiftly into confusion and surrender once the conspirators realized their plan had already failed. "Alira," Kaelin said, reaching her side and gripping her shoulders, as though reassuring himself she was truly unharmed. "Are you hurt? Tell me honestly." "I'm all right," she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Frightened, but unharmed. They meant to take me somewhere, to sever my connection to the wards, though I don't fully understand how they intended to accomplish that." The investigation that followed, conducted swiftly and thoroughly under Kaelin's direct oversight, revealed the truth within a matter of days. Silas, questioned separately from the others, and offered leniency in exchange for honesty, confessed readily to Garrick's involvement, and further questioning of the captured guards confirmed what Alira had already begun to suspect on her own, had likely helped arrange the timing itself, using information gathered from her own careful observations of the castle's routines. Kaelin's expression, when he received this confirmation, hardened into something Alira had never seen from him before, cold fury simmering just beneath careful, controlled restraint. "She will answer for this," he said quietly. "Both of them will." "What will happen to them?" Alira asked, uncertain how she felt about the answer. "Garrick will face formal charges before the full council," Kaelin said. "Conspiracy against the crown, endangerment of a member of the royal household. He will lose his position, and likely his freedom, depending on the council's judgment." He paused, studying her carefully. "Marisol's fate is less clear. She is not a citizen of this kingdom, and her involvement, while significant, was arranged through Garrick's influence, rather than her own authority. I would understand if you wished her to face consequences here regardless." Alira considered the question for a long moment, thinking of years of quiet cruelty, of a lifetime spent believing she was worth nothing, and found, to her own surprise, that she felt no desire for cruelty in return, only a tired, weary sadness that things had come to this point at all. "Send her back to Moonfall," she said finally. Let our father and stepmother deal with what she's done. I want no part in deciding her punishment, Kaelin. I only want this to be over. Kaelin studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his expression, before nodding slowly. As you wish, he said. It will be done. The conspiracy's collapse revealed something else, however, something that troubled Kaelin far more than Garrick's ambition or Marisol's jealousy ever could. During the investigation, evidence emerged suggesting Garrick had not acted merely out of personal belief that the bloodline magic was dangerous. Correspondence discovered among his private papers hinted at contact with forces beyond the kingdom's borders, forces with a vested interest in ensuring the ancient wards remained weakened rather than restored. Forces, the evidence suggested, connected directly to the Hollow itself. This was never simply about court politics, Kaelin said grimly. Reviewing the discovered correspondence late that night in his private study, Elira seated across from him, equally troubled by the implications. Someone, or something, beyond our borders wanted you removed before the ritual could ever be attempted, which means the danger to you, and to this kingdom, is far greater, and far more immediate than we previously understood. Elira felt a cold weight settle into her stomach at his words, understanding, with growing clarity, that the quiet months of careful training and slowly blossoming affection had been, in retrospect, a temporary calm before a storm that was only now beginning to fully reveal itself. The days following the discovery of Garrick's true allegiances passed in a blur of urgent council meetings and hurried preparations, the entire castle shifting from its previous rhythm of cautious, measured training into something far more pressing and immediate. Kaelin's scholars, Colton chief among them, worked tirelessly to determine exactly how much time remained before the weakened wards along the northern boundary failed entirely, and the answer they eventually arrived at left little room for the careful patience Kaelin had insisted upon for months. 3 weeks, Colton said grimly, addressing the assembled council in a chamber thick with tension. Perhaps 4, if we are fortunate and the current reinforcements hold. Beyond that, we cannot guarantee the boundary will remain sealed. And the ritual itself? One of the older council members asked, his weathered face creased with worry. Is the girl truly prepared for something of this magnitude? Untrained bloodlines attempting rituals of this scale have failed catastrophically in the historical record. More than once. She is not fully trained, Colton admitted. But she has progressed further in these past months than any of us anticipated, and her connection to the wards, when tested under pressure during the recent incident, proved stronger than her careful training sessions alone had suggested. Elira, seated near the back of the council chamber, listened to the discussion, with a mixture of determination and quiet fear. She had spent months learning to accept the weight of her unexpected inheritance, the strange bloodline that had upended her entire understanding of herself. But the reality of what lay ahead, an actual ritual, one capable of either saving or endangering an entire kingdom, felt different from anything her training had truly prepared her for. There is another consideration, Kaelin said, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber, silencing the murmured debate. The correspondence discovered among Garrick's belongings makes clear that whatever forces lie beyond the failing boundary are aware of Elira's existence and are actively working to prevent the wards from being restored. If we delay further, attempting to train her to some theoretical standard of perfect readiness, we risk losing the opportunity entirely, or facing an attack timed specifically to exploit our hesitation. The council chamber fell silent at this, the weight of his words settling heavily over the gathered advisors. Elira felt every eye in the room shift toward her, and she straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet each gaze steadily despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. I understand the risk, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, but I would rather attempt this ritual now, with whatever preparation we have managed, than wait for a perfect readiness that may never come, only to watch the boundary fail regardless. Brave words, the same weathered council member said, not unkindly. But bravery alone will not sustain a connection to power on the scale this ritual requires, child. If you falter partway through, the consequences could be severe, for you and for the kingdom both. Then I will not falter, Elira said, though privately she could not fully guarantee such a promise, even to herself. Kaelin moved to stand beside her then, his presence steady and reassuring, despite the gravity of the discussion. We will prepare her as thoroughly as the remaining time allows, he said, addressing the full council with an authority that left little room for further argument. And when the time comes, I will stand beside her throughout the ritual itself, whatever risk that entails for either of us. The remaining weeks passed in an intensity of preparation Alira had not previously experienced, every waking hour devoted to strengthening her connection to the ancient wards, Colton pushing her through increasingly demanding exercises, while Kaelin remained a constant, steadying presence throughout. The easy warmth that had grown between them during the calmer autumn months deepened further during this period of urgent preparation, forged in the shared understanding that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. "I'm frightened," Alira admitted one evening, only days before the ritual was scheduled to take place, as they sat together near the fire in Kaelin's private study, the weight of the approaching trial pressing heavily on both of them. "Not merely of failing, though that fear is considerable. I'm frightened of what happens to us, to this, if something goes wrong." Kaelin reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady against her own trembling fingers. "I will not pretend the danger isn't real," he said quietly. "I would be lying to you, and I promised myself long ago never to lie to you about matters that truly mattered. But I will also not pretend I have any intention of losing you to this, Alira. Whatever happens during that ritual, I intend to be standing beside you through every moment of it." "Even if standing beside me puts you at risk as well?" "Especially then," Kaelin said, a faint, determined smile touching his lips. "I did not choose you merely to watch you face danger alone, while I remained safely at a distance. Whatever we face together, or not at all." The morning of the ritual arrived colder and clearer than any day that entire winter. The sky above the northern boundary stretched pale and cloudless, as though even the weather itself understood the significance of what was about to unfold. Alira stood at the edge of the ancient boundary alongside Kaelin and Colton, the assembled council and a contingent of the kingdom's most trusted warriors, gathered at a careful distance behind them, watching with a mixture of hope and apprehension that mirrored her own. "Remember your training," Colton said quietly, his weathered hands trembling slightly with nerves he could not fully hide despite his careful composure. "Reach for the connection slowly. Do not force it. Let the ward recognize what you are, rather than attempting to seize its power through will alone." Alira nodded, closing her eyes and steadying her breathing, aware of Kaelin standing close beside her, his presence a quiet anchor against the fear still coiling in her chest. She reached toward the familiar ancient hum of the boundary's remaining power, the same sensation she had touched briefly during her earlier training exercise, and felt it respond to her presence with a recognition that seemed almost eager, as though the ward itself had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. The connection, when it fully formed, arrived with a force far greater than anything she had previously experienced, ancient power flooding through her in waves that left her gasping, silver light tracing intricate patterns across every inch of exposed skin, bright enough that several of the watching warriors shielded their eyes against the sudden brilliance. "Alira," Kaelin said urgently, his voice cutting through the overwhelming rush of sensation. "Stay with me. Focus on my voice." She clung to the sound of his voice as an anchor, using it to steady the overwhelming flood of ancient power now coursing through her, guiding it carefully, rather than allowing it to sweep her away entirely. Slowly, with painstaking effort, she began directing that power toward the weakened sections of the boundary itself, watching through half-closed eyes as faint cracks in the ancient magic, invisible to ordinary sight but painfully clear to her newly awakened senses, began knitting themselves back together, silver light spreading across the boundary, like frost spreading across glass. It was working. She could feel it working, feel the boundary strengthening beneath her guided power, but the effort required to sustain such a massive connection grew increasingly exhausting with every passing moment, her body straining under a weight far greater than anything her months of careful training had truly prepared her to bear alone. "I don't know how much longer I can hold this," she gasped, her voice strained, sweat beading across her forehead despite the winter chill. Kaelin's grip on her hand tightened, and without hesitation, he reached deeper, offering his own strength, his own steady presence, as an additional anchor against the overwhelming pull of ancient magic threatening to sweep her away entirely. "You are not alone in this," he said fiercely. "Draw on me if you need to. Whatever strength I have is yours." The offer, freely and fully given, steadied something within her that mere determination alone could not have accomplished. and with his presence bolstering her own flagging strength, Elira found the resolve to push through those final exhausting moments, guiding the last of the ancient power into place, sealing the weakened boundary fully and completely. The silver light finally faded, leaving behind an ancient boundary restored to full strength, and Elira collapsed forward, caught immediately in Kaelin's steady arms as exhaustion overwhelmed her entirely. "It's done," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The wards are restored. Around them, the assembled council and warriors erupted into astonished, relieved celebration, the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally lifting from an entire kingdom's shoulders. But Elira, safely held against Kaelin's chest, as exhaustion claimed the last of her consciousness, registered only the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would not face them alone. Elira woke slowly, the soft warmth of unfamiliar sunlight falling across her face, and for a long moment, she remained still, uncertain whether the events at the northern boundary had truly happened, or existed only within some exhausted dream. Then she noticed the familiar surroundings of her own chamber, and Kaelin, seated in a chair drawn close beside her bed, his expression tight with worry that eased visibly the moment her eyes opened. "You're awake," he said, relief flooding his voice as he reached for her hand. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Elira admitted, her voice hoarse. "But whole. The ritual worked, didn't it? I remember the boundary sealing, but everything after that is unclear." "You collapsed immediately after completing the connection," Kaelin explained. "Colton assured me it was simple exhaustion, nothing more serious, though you have slept for nearly 2 full days. The boundary held throughout, stronger than it has been in generations, according to every scholar who has examined it since." Relief washed through her at his words, followed quickly by a swell of quiet pride she had not expected to feel so strongly. She had done it. Whatever fear and uncertainty had plagued her throughout the months leading up to that moment, she had faced the ritual and succeeded, not merely for herself, but for an entire kingdom that had, not so very long ago, viewed her as nothing more than an unexpected complication attached to their king's choice of bride. "The kingdom," she said, sitting up slightly despite Kaelin's gentle protest. "How are people reacting?" "Truly, Kaelin, don't soften it for my sake." "Truly," Kaelin said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "The kingdom is celebrating. Word of what you accomplished has spread through every corner of Crimson territory, and beyond it as well, I suspect, given how quickly news travels along trade routes. The same council members who questioned whether you were prepared for this ritual now speak of little else besides your courage." "And Colton?" Elira asked. "How is he?" "Insufferably proud," Kaelin said, his smile widening further. "He has already begun drafting a new chapter for the old texts, documenting your success, insisting future generations of scholars deserve an accurate account, rather than whatever exaggerated legend inevitably develops over time." Elira laughed at that, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised her with how naturally it came, and Kaelin's expression softened further at the sound of it, watching her with an open affection he no longer bothered attempting to hide. Over the following days, as Elira's strength gradually returned, she found herself venturing beyond her chamber more frequently, walking the castle corridors and courtyards that had once felt so foreign and intimidating during her first bewildered weeks at court. The reception she received now differed entirely from those early days, courtiers and servants alike offering genuine warmth and respect rather than the curious, skeptical glances she had grown accustomed to enduring. Even Marisol's brief, ugly conspiracy seemed to have faded into distant memory for most of the court, though Elira occasionally wondered how her stepsister fared back at Moonfall, whether Selene had received her with anger, or, perhaps, some grudging measure of concern beneath the anger. She found she genuinely hoped Marisol would find some measure of peace eventually, wherever her ambitions ultimately led her, though she felt no particular urge to seek out news of her stepsister's continued fate. It was nearly a month after the ritual, on an evening when winter's harsh grip had finally begun loosening its hold on the mountainside, that Kaelin requested Elira join him in the castle's great hall, for what he described only as an important gathering, offering no further explanation despite her curious questions. She arrived to find the great hall transformed, garlands of winter flowers strung along the rafters, much as they had been during that first choosing ceremony so many months earlier, though the atmosphere here carried none of the tension and uncertainty of that distant night. The full council stood assembled, alongside Colton, and dozens of court members Alira had come to know well during her months at the castle, all watching with expressions of genuine warmth as she made her way toward the front of the hall, where Kaelin waited. "What is this?" she asked quietly, once she reached his side, though something in his expression already suggested the answer. "A formal recognition," Kaelin said, turning to address the full assembly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Months ago, in a hall much like this one, I made a choice that many present here doubted, questioned, and in some cases actively worked against. I chose Alira Voss, not merely because of the bloodline she carried, though I will not pretend that discovery did not shape the beginning of our story together." He turned to face her fully then, taking both her hands in his own, his expression open and sincere, in a way that left no room for doubt about the sincerity of what followed. "I chose her because, in the months since that night, I have come to understand precisely what kind of person she truly is. Courageous beyond what her quiet nature might suggest to those who judge too quickly. Steady under pressure that would break lesser resolve. And capable of a warmth and honesty this court, myself included, desperately needed reminding of." The hall remained silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene, and Alira felt her own eyes sting with unexpected emotion, as Kaelin continued. "Alira restored the ancient wards protecting this entire kingdom, not as a tool wielded by circumstance, but as an equal partner standing beside me throughout every step of that dangerous ritual. She deserves recognition not merely as my wife, but as Luna of this kingdom, in her own right, with all the respect and authority that title carries." He gestured then, and Colton stepped forward carrying an ornate silver circlet, delicate crescents worked into its design, that Alira recognized immediately from the ancient symbol marking the ward text she had spent so many months studying. "Alira Voss," Kaelin said, taking the circlet from Colton's hands, "will you accept this kingdom's recognition, and stand beside me not merely as my wife, but as its Luna, protector of these lands and everyone within them?" Alira looked out across the assembled hall, at faces that had once regarded her with curiosity or outright skepticism, now watching with genuine warmth and respect, and thought of the girl who had once hidden behind a wooden post at the back of a very different hall, believing herself unworthy of anyone's notice. "I accept," she said, her voice steady and clear despite the emotion swelling in her chest. "Gladly, and with my whole heart." Kaelin placed the circlet gently upon her head, and the assembled hall erupted into genuine celebration, warm applause and cheers echoing off ancient stone walls that had witnessed countless ceremonies throughout the kingdom's long history, though few, Alira suspected, had carried quite this particular blend of triumph and tenderness. Later that evening, once the formal celebration had wound down into quieter, more intimate conversation among the lingering guests, Kaelin found her standing near one of the great hall's tall windows, gazing out at the mountains silvered beneath a clear winter moon, the same moon that had first revealed the ancient marking hidden within her skin so many months earlier. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her, "about how this story began?" Alira considered the question honestly, thinking of humiliation and fear, of danger and betrayal, of months of careful training and slowly blossoming affection that had ultimately led her to exactly this moment, standing beside a man she had come to love completely, wearing a crown she had never once imagined might belong to her. "None," she said finally, turning to meet his gaze fully. "Every difficult moment led me here, to this life, to you. I would not change a single part of it, however painful some of those parts were to endure." Kaelin smiled, drawing her close against him as they both turned back toward the window, watching moonlight silver the mountains beyond the castle walls. Two people who had begun as strangers bound by circumstance and ancient bloodlines, and had found, against every expectation either of them once carried, something far deeper and more lasting than either duty or destiny alone could have ever promised. The girl once called too ugly to be chosen, now stood crowned as Luna, chosen not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine love hard-won through shared hardship and quiet devotion, her place beside the Alpha King finally, truly, and completely her own.